Hello, everyone. Salam and greetings to all who are listening to this recording. My paper for the Sufi conference on religious freedom is titled Creating Space for Piety, Practice and Dialogue, Religious Freedom and North American Sufi Devotionalism. For the convenience of those who are watching this recording, and for the sake of limiting myself to a strict timeline, I will simply read out from the paper that I have written. The vision and practice of religious freedom in the US upholds the spirit of the First Amendment of the US Constitution that rules out any legal formulation concerning an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Understandably, this has created the space for plural religious traditions to flourish, dominated by major religions from the Abrahamic tradition, like Christianity, Islam, Judaism, as well as non-Abrahamic ones, like Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikhism. In such a diverse religious space, what is more interesting are not the big names, but the minor faith traditions, who on most occasions draw their inspiration from the Christian church, the teachings of Jesus, the Islamic Sharia, teachings and practices of Prophet Muhammad, yet sustain their own beliefs on a bedrock of what can be called an inspired spirituality. A relevant approach, perhaps, to chart the historical career of these minor faith traditions, driven by a strong spiritual impulse, is not to stop by merely acknowledging their presence. Rather, it is important to study their ways of negotiating the diverse arena of American society and culture. To frame it through a question would be to ask, in what ways did these minor traditions appeal and adapt themselves to American sensibility and emotions? However, it is one thing to pose this question for any spiritual tradition inspired by Christianity, followed by the majority of the US population. It is a completely different challenge to pose the same question for an obscure spiritual tradition like Sufism, drawn primarily from Islam, the youngest Abrahamic faith whose social presence in America has only gradually increased over the last century. In the following discussion, keeping the aforementioned question as the pole star, we explore ways in which Sufi movements from the early 20th century manifested itself in the America. Spiritual traditions arriving in the US in the early 1900s were primarily traced to the East, an exotic civilizational idea fed and sustained by Orientalist scholarship, whose exploration of Sufi wisdom through the poetry of Hafiz from Shiraz and Jalaluddin Rumi from Turkey, among others, introduced Sufism to a Euro-American audience. In the 1960s and 70s, the countercultural movement, riding on the first wave of feminism, demand for civil rights, led young middle-class Americans to protest against racism and the Vietnam War, criticizing established religions for their failure to contain the evils of technocracy, all of which signaled the second phase of Sufi movements. The third phase saw the transnational dimension of American Sufi movements strengthen itself when favorable immigration laws opened the US territory to international communities. The fourth phase of Sufi activities can be seen in the post-globalization era of the 1990s, when spiritual practices and retreats came to counter a hyper-consumerist culture. Some major personalities who carried Sufism into the US were connected to their parent societies in South Asia, primarily Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and the island nation of Sri Lanka. Since the early 13th century, South Asia has emerged as the most important region in the entire Eastern world of Islam, where Sufism flourished under multiple spiritual orders who migrated eastward from Iran and Iraq under the Mongol impact. When Sufism arrived in South Asia, Sufi masters found themselves preaching to a non-Muslim population, having little idea of Abrahamic religious beliefs. Centuries later, history would repeat itself in rather interesting ways when Sufi masters from Southern Asia arrived in the US to preach to an American non-Muslim audience who had little idea of what Sufism meant as an Islamic spiritual tradition. Faced with this challenge, early Sufi masters had to think of ways by which they could successfully convey the message of Sufism, and to some degree that of Islam as well, to an audience largely unaware yet receptive. Sufism needed to be garbed and packaged in ways intelligible and appealing to an American audience, standing at the crossroads of global cultures, steeped in modern sensibilities and multiple religious affiliations. Observing generations of Sufi activities in America, scholars writing from the 1990s came to see this movement along two approaches. The hybrid model, which combined traditional Islamic practices with the American social environment, while the perennial model emphasized universalist trends of religion, thereby dispensing with any formal adherence to Islam by its members. By de-recognizing the practice of Islamic law as central to Sufism, these perennialists allowed followers of any traditional religion to embark on the path of spiritual realization through practices culled from various religious traditions under the belief that they all emanate from a single true source. This assumption led to the assumption latent in this approach shows a clear influence from the Abrahamic belief in one God as the source of all knowledge and creation. A second group of perennialists, though accommodating and universalist in approach, put up a semblance of attachment to the Sharia. At the end of the day, these two approaches can be seen to project a conflict of cultural identity, either by upholding normative Muslim cultural styles of attire, name, religious worship, or blending into the host culture in an accommodating and adaptive manner. As we turn into the careers of some Sufi masters in America, we will see how universalist trends and traditional Islamic practices would intersect in complex ways. The next section looks into the life of America's earliest Sufi master, Inayat Khan, who arrived in America, specifically in New York, from Bombay in 1912. Inayat Khan's dates are 1880 to 1927. Inayat Khan, a musician trained in the Hindustani classical tradition, was affiliated to the Chishti order, South Asia's earliest and most popular Sufi order, which arrived from Afghanistan in the early 13th century. Inayat Khan's arrival inaugurated the first phase of Sufi activities in America that was already showing an increasing interest in the esoteric, spiritual, philosophical traditions of the East, formalized through the Theosophical Society, as well as the reception of the wisdom of Hafiz and Rumi, as we said earlier, which were deeply followed by figures of the Transcendentalist movement, like Ralph Emerson. As a believer in the oldest Sufi tradition from South Asia, it was expected that Inayat Khan would project his spirituality through the lenses of Islamic tradition and practice, resting on the foundation of Sharia. Rather interestingly, Inayat Khan spoke through the language of universalism that was transmitted through the practice of universal worship, drawing from scriptural traditions across world religions, to be interiorized by his spiritually inquisitive American Christian audience through chanting, recitations, meditation, and concentration practices. This movement, which came to be known as the Sufi order, did not require followers to have a mandatory conversion to Islam and practice the Sharia. Therefore, this eclectic tradition continued under Inayat Khan's son and spiritual successor, Pir Vilayat Khan, who passed away in 2004. Vilayat Khan trained himself with a Hindu teacher as well as a Sufi master, incorporating, I quote, breathing techniques, tantric style exercises based on chakra visualization, and Christian and alchemical symbolism, unquote. So we can see the different kinds of influences Pir Vilayat Khan incorporated as part of his eclectic training. Interestingly, however, neither Inayat Khan nor his son could dissociate themselves completely from the bedrock of Islamic spiritual practices, which they had interiorized as part of their affiliation to the South Asian Chishti Nizami Sufi order. Though the 5 daily prayers of Islam were not included as a mandatory practice, the Sufi ritual of zikr, which is recitation and repetition of the divine names, was clearly the central practice of this order. So was the role of inayat and vilayat as Sufi murshids or masters, and the use of music to facilitate meditation and the conditioning of the heart. As membership increased during Vilayat Khan's lifetime, community reading of the unpublished writings left behind by Inayat Khan became an important practice among the adepts, clearly reflecting a centuries-old tradition among the Chishti Sufis of South Asia to record instructions and messages of saints in writing. These collections would be known as malfuzat, something that is written, to be handed down across generations as a normative body of spiritual knowledge and instruction, replacing the master after his spiritual demise. So whatever is being said by the master, his lessons, his teachings, his preachings would be recorded by the disciples. Those collections would be corrected and rectified by the master from time to time, and these would constitute a corpus of normative spiritual knowledge for the following generations. Also historic was the practice of giving spiritual names among the followers of Inayat Khan and Vilayat Khan, though these names were drawn from varied religious traditions, Islamic, Hinduism, etc. Chishti Sufis are historically renowned for their deep social network across the length and breadth of the Indian subcontinent, independently as well as by co-training disciples from other orders. In the United States, Inayat Khan's endeavors took a similar trajectory by forging regional as well as trans-regional connections. Fazal Inayat Khan started the Sufi way in England. Hidayat Inayat Khan carried forward the lineage of his father through the international Sufi movement based in Holland, but also active in US and Canada. Both Fazal and Hidayat would be the sons of Inayat Khan. Murshid Samuel Lewis from San Francisco became a disciple of Inayat Khan in 1923. This training led Lewis to form the Sufi Islamia Ruhaniyat Society, also abbreviated as SIRS, SIRS. This was founded shortly before the death of Lewis. Lewis's disciples followed the example of their master by joining Vilayat Khan's Sufi order in 1971, only to part ways 6 years later. So this is what a very brief introduction on one of the earliest Sufi masters and his sons and disciples who set up the idea of Sufi movements in America. Next, we move to a more regional Sufi master in Philadelphia called Baba Muhayyiddin. Decades of the 1960s and 70s witnessed a crisis and struggle for moral order within the American society. A series of unsettling events, locally and globally, as mentioned above, led to a realization of moral depravity and hollowness among a large section of the population. Individual manifestations of this anxiety through soul searching may be difficult to trace and will not be delved into in this presentation. But one example stands out and might help in furthering this discussion. In fall 1969, a doctoral student from Sri Lanka studying at the University of Pennsylvania listened in all eagerness to a young woman who had traveled from New Orleans to Philadelphia specifically to meet him. As she narrated her experiences of spiritual turmoil that began in November 1963, leaving her emotionally distraught in search of spiritual guidance, this doctoral student, whose name was Muhammad Maroof, offered help by telling her about a Sufi master he knew back in Sri Lanka. The name of the Sufi master was Muhammad Rahim Baba Muhayyiddin. As reaching out to Sufi masters from the East once more seemed to be the way out in this state of crisis, this lady wrote to Baba in October 1969, seeking help, spiritual help. As exchange of letters became regular between them, she shared with Baba personal and worldly problems that accentuated her emotional crisis. Her father leaving for Vietnam on war duty, leaving behind an anxious family. The assassination of strong voices for civil rights like Malcolm X in 1965 and Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968, racial issues in Philadelphia, and other such problems. Since this lady was not financially strong enough to relocate to Baba's ashram or hermitage in Sri Lanka, she decided to sponsor his visit to Philadelphia, bringing together a group of like-minded spiritual seekers and yoga enthusiasts. The Baba Muhayyiddin Fellowship, or the BMF as we know it today, was informally founded in late 1971, paving the way for Baba's arrival in October 1971. Who was Baba and what was his career in Sri Lanka like, which catapulted him to the American social and spiritual arena at this time of crisis and moral corrosion? This is a question through which we turn to the South Asian story of Baba very briefly. Sometime between 1940 and 42, after long years of meditation in solitude, Baba emerged from the jungles of southern Sri Lanka, moved into the northern part of the island and settled in Jaffna. Though he claimed affiliation to the Qadiriya Sufi order, a global Sufi lineage originating in Baghdad under Abdul Qadir Gilani in 12th century, Baba's initial disciples were increasingly poor Hindus from the lower sections of the society and not many Muslims, though Christians and Buddhists would occasionally visit him. It was not until a decade later that Baba could acquire a worn-down Dutch warehouse to establish an independent ashram or commune in 1952. In the following decade, Baba cleared forest lands in the vicinity of that farmland to start cultivating rice, vegetables, coconuts, in order to support his growing family of disciples. This would be a model that would be readily followed by his American disciples later as well. As the community started to expand in Jaffna and Baba's name traveled as a healer, counselor, exorcist, and Sufi teacher, he came to be recognized as a guru, a perfect man, what we call as the insan-e-kamil, with a pure heart. The urban educated elite, comprising Muslim intellectuals, Buddhist theosophists, started organizing his sessions in Colombo, the capital city, that led to the formation of the Serendib Sufi Study Circle in 1962. This study circle focused on philosophical discussions, spiritual practices like zikr, and community services like distribution of free food. This elite group of Muslim followers came to identify Baba as a Sufi saint or a sheikh. Perhaps for the first time, Baba was identified as a sheikh. Interestingly, it was from this clientele of educated urban elite Muslims in Colombo, Kandy, and Matale that his name was carried across the 7 seas into the farthest west, where he landed in 1971. His initial followers were African American Muslim communities from Philadelphia who attached themselves in good numbers, pushing the fellowship to move out to a bigger space in the outskirts of Philadelphia in 1973 by converting a Jewish community center, something that we see even today, where the BMF is housed. Baba's early teaching drew freely from Hindu, Buddhist, Christian, and Islamic traditions, which did not foreground the Islamic elements, thereby allowing Baba to be accepted as a South Asian guru with a typical Hindu Indian idea of a master, whose circle of teaching and preaching did not require an exclusive religious identity and adherence to formal religious practice. However, over the next decade, 2 significant developments determined the fellowship's social capital and religious investment. With more and more Euro-American followers responding to Baba's teaching and preaching, the demographic scale of the fellowship shifted from poor, lower middle class African-American Muslim communities to affluent urban elite Euro-American followers, most of whom were non-Muslims. Despite Baba's repeated attempts to teach his followers the merits of looking beyond divisions of race, class, caste, gender, his message proved insufficient to transcend the social realities of the age. A large section of the African American members of the fellowship left. The second development was a clear stride towards Islamization of what was till now a universalist Sufi tradition. Important markers of this were seen in the formalization of the Sufi practice of zikr in 1976, instituting the 5 daily prayers in 1981, and finally, the most important creation of a ritualized space for all of the above practices with the completion of the mosque in May 1984. This would be more than a decade after Baba landed in Philadelphia. Baba's Qadiriya affiliation is enshrined above the entrance of the mosque, which we can see even today, a declaration of the fellowship's attachment to a historical Sufi order, a trans-regional Sufi order. In current times, the mosque serves as a religious and educational center for immigrants, as well as Baba's immediate followers. A gradual acquiring of an Islamic dimension by the fellowship in America is interesting when juxtaposed against his ashram in Jaffna, which continued to be maintained by a Hindu follower of Baba. Baba's transnational career based on spiritual practice and teaching, though encompassed a universalist attitude, nonetheless could not hide the tensions of his continuous negotiations with the immediate sociocultural environment. And this would be the last section of our discussion. These tensions would play out in meaningful ways after his death. Take, for example, his last resting place. After he passed away in December 1986, he was initially buried in the fellowship house in the outskirts of Philadelphia. Thereafter, his senior disciples wanted to build a shrine over his tomb to preserve the lasting spiritual charisma of their master for future generations and visitors. It may be assumed that some of these disciples experienced a Sufi shrine in South Asia when they accompanied Baba to Sri Lanka, and hence carried back the novel idea to America. This was and still remains quite a novel idea in America. Baba's shrine was designed by Michael Green, an American Sufi artist, and built in East Fallowfield, 40 miles outside Philadelphia. This land was meant to serve as a Muslim cemetery for members of the fellowship and a communal farm, much similar to the Jaffna model. On a South Asian model, the shrine, or what we call the mazar, resembling a tomb chamber, was built over his earthly remains. The current author, which means when I paid a visit to this farm, to his shrine, and while I was paying my respects at the shrine, I could identify very interesting aesthetic similarity with the South Asian Sufi shrines here. Baba's tomb is covered with dark green cloth, having Quranic verses in golden calligraphy. Lattice screens, typical of South Asian Sufi tombs, were replaced by panoramic glass windows, allowing the interplay of natural light, creating an imagery of the heaven. The room thoughtfully kept copies of the Quran, prayer books, and prayer beads for visitors and devotees to sit close to the tomb and pray. Baba's personal room at the fellowship has similar things as well. However, these things are made sacred. I emphasize on the word sacred, by Baba's touch and the living memory that he used these items during his lifetime. Followers and visitors to the fellowship, aspiring for a corporeal attachment with the saint, touch and kiss these items. On the other hand, by building a mazar over Baba's earthly remains and containing his spiritual charisma to a physical space, a long-awaited opportunity were utilized by both American and immigrant Muslims to construct a sacred geography. A geography that would connect his ashram in Jaffna in Sri Lanka, his fellowship in Philadelphia, to his last resting place outside Philadelphia. All of these mediated by the physical presence of Baba as a Sufi saint. An opportunity was also created for current and later generations aspiring to seek blessings or baraka from Baba through the ritual of visitation or ziyarat to his shrine. Additionally, through regular commemoration of Baba's death anniversary or urs, through communal prayer, feasting, social congregation, his memory and earthly remains were successfully incorporated into a cosmos of Sufism, thoroughly Islamic, through symbols, rituals, performances, and commemorations, so intrinsic to Sufi personalities across the Islamic world, and also in South Asia. At his death, Baba's journey from a universalist guru starting from Sri Lanka to an Islamic Sufi ending in Philadelphia was completed. It is interesting that the sustenance of Baba's continuing legacy as a South Asian Sufi master is tensely negotiated through competing claims put forth by his Euro-American followers alongside an ever-growing South Asian diaspora of Indians, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, and Sri Lankans who seek his blessings through a set of rituals carried across from their own cultural backyard. Like shrine rituals, like offering a new covering to the tomb, lighting incense, ritual performances like singing in the memory and praise of the saint, cultural practices like cooking food and offering it in the memory of the saint, and physical congregation in the proximity of the shrine. This transnational connection creates moments of anxiety for Baba's Euro-American shrine caretakers, who perhaps unknowingly impose a code of conduct on the shrine. Made visible through signs requesting visitors to honor the silence of the place through silent meditation and remembrance, while refraining from noisy activities, lighting incense, and sprinkling rose water on the tomb. These are actions which are so typical of Sufi shrines in South Asia. To conclude then, historically, it remains undeniable that Sufism has been profoundly shaped by local cultural and social realities as it moved into diverse geocultural zones across the world. Over the 20th century, American religious arena opened up to global influences where Sufism is but one of the many strands. Our discussion has taken us through transnational Sufi movements from South Asia as it unfolded in the United States, from a universalist approach to an increasingly Islamic form and practice. We might easily tend to lose sight of this diverse journey of Sufi movements into the hearts and lives of Americans if we plunge ourselves into debates of exclusive orthodoxy. Rather, what benefits this discussion for us is the inclusive approach adopted by Sufi masters like Inayat Khan, his disciples, and of course, Baba Muhayyiddin, as they responded to the spiritual aspirations of their American followers, irrespective of their social position and faith affiliation. This created complexities, of course, as we saw above. But most importantly, this also created room for dialogue, as Sufi masters in America recognized the freedom of speech and practice in a diverse American religious landscape. Thank you.